All right, welcome to the Lsvw. We're here today discussing Jacob Montgomery and Brendan Nyhan's paper, Congressional Staff and the Extended Party Network in the U.S. House of Representatives. We're joined by a few folks that are going to offer comments on that paper as well as the authors, and I will go ahead and go down the line and allow folks to introduce themselves now.
Okay, I'm Brendan Nyhan, Dartmouth College.
I'm Jacob Montgomery at Washington University in St. Louis.
David?
Oh, David Karol, University of Maryland.
Jason Roberts, University of North Carolina.
Jennifer Victor, George Mason University.
And I'm Nate Monroe at UC Merced. So the way this will work, as all LSVWs, we're going to have the authors give us just a few introductory comments, not a full presentation of the paper. For those of you that are watching, you can go to lsvw.org, and the paper will be posted there, so if you want to read the paper and then watch the discussion, you can. But here today, we're going to have just some introductory comments, and then we'll set the discussants loose on each sort of part of the paper. We'll begin with a discussion of the sort of overall framing and sort of general big picture of the paper, and then we'll move on to discuss theoretical issues, and then design and empirical issues, and then we'll sort of wrap up with miscellaneous comments. Of course, we might jump around some, and folks should feel free to sort of move off topic, and I'll rein us back in if needed. If you want to sort of get in line or make a comment, sort of set of comments on your main section, just sort of wave and put your hand up to get my attention, and I'll put you on the list. If it's urgent and you want to sort of make a little small point, you can either sort of put one finger up or your fingers like this, and I'll try to get you in right away as soon as we can to sort of add on to whatever point is being made at the moment. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jacob and Brendan, and they can give us a few introductory comments on the paper.
Brendan, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks to you guys for doing this. It's fantastic. Can't believe how well it's actually working, despite the technical difficulties. So, yeah, we're really grateful to you guys for taking the time. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say, by way of introduction, the things I think Jacob and I think are most important and interesting about the paper, and that we're eager to get your thoughts on, are the shift towards focusing on the role of staff in Congress, which is something that both of us substantively believe is important and has received very little scholarly attention, especially in recent years, and bringing staff into the modern literature on the role of parties and party networks specifically, and looking at staff as one of the party networks that helps link together the two parties in general and specifically among legislators. So I think those are the areas that we think we're most excited about, as well as the new data on staff themselves, which we hope is itself a kind of contribution. Okay, let me see if Jacob wants to add anything to that.
I don't think that's enough for now. We already made them suffer through the actual paper.
Okay, and of course you guys will have chances to can jump in and respond at any time as comments are going on, so we can have a bit of a discussion and back and forth as we go. Okay, so let's talk big picture and framing. Does anyone want to sort of start us off? Jason, Jen, David, with some big picture comments, framing comments?
I can start if you want.
Okay.
I have to say at the outset that I just really like this paper. My biggest problem with this paper is that I didn't write it, because basically this is a paper that I've had in my head for a long time, and I think I told you guys this before. I'm envious of the data that you've been able to acquire here, and really admiring the ways that you've been able to use it to bring some I think really important contributions to the literature. So, I think a huge kudos to you guys with what you're doing here. In my mind, I think one of the biggest challenges here is that there are so many interesting questions that could be answered with the type of data that you have, and that are in the realm of where you're thinking about things here, that it's difficult to narrow it down to one compelling story that comes through with sort of a solid coherence. I don't have a huge problem with the paper as it is now in its current form, in terms of, being there's sort of two primary questions in the paper right now, and I think that's fine, because I think you deliver on both of them. But what I keep coming around to, though, because I come at this topic from a very biased perspective. I've already drunk the Kool-Aid on we should be studying relationships. And part of what this paper is doing is trying to get others to drink that Kool-Aid, I think. And the way it's pitched right now, because of the sort of awesomeness of the data, is that it's pitched as a staff networks paper, basically. That's very appealing to me, but I wonder, this is a little bit thinking out loud, I wonder if there isn't a way to pitch it that isn't so much this is a staff networks paper, that might make it more appealing to a broader audience. And I don't have a good answer for this, but the question that keeps rolling around in my head is, how does studying Congress or legislatures from this perspective, from the perspective of studying staff movements and so forth, how does that help us understand something about legislative behavior, which is ultimately what you're trying to explain, that we didn't understand before? And I feel like that one of the tensions in, and I'm getting back to Nate's question about the big picture here, one of the tensions in the paper is that the paper is really about staff networks, but I think it could be about a much broader question, because really, at the end of the day, your question is about legislative behavior. You're explaining some legislative behavior using a novel data set and a novel approach. And you've focused so much on the novel data set and novel approach in a way that I like, but in order to get it out in a broader way, I wonder if actually you should dial that back, and make the question of the paper the question about, more about the dependent variable than independent variable, I think is the way I want to put it. And now I feel like I'm filibustering, so I'm going to stop.
Not at all.
And I clearly pissed off Jason.
We lost Jason. So, David, do you have some big picture comments?
I think I agree with Jen. This is a very interesting data, and there are older studies of staff which you do a good job citing, but it's a different Congress now in some important ways. So I think a look at a more recent period is definitely justified. I think that I don't know that everything goes together. Like effectiveness and the party story are not necessarily the same thing. I mean, and if the question of the paper is, does staff matter, then you can say, well, here's two different ways in which staff matter, right? They matter for voting behavior, and then they matter for legislative effectiveness, and maybe it's different staff that are more important. But then that's, like effectiveness is not in the title of the paper, right? So that's just a different frame, and I'm not saying one is better than the other. But if it was about staff, it could be one paper with two different measures, or if it was about the substantive, the other things, I don't know that it goes together. And more papers is better than fewer, right? More at bats, just because of everything is so random or so that's one thing I would say. I have lots of more specific, smaller, points, but I guess this is not the time for that yet.
We'll have a shot. You'll have a shot at those when we move on, or when we get to the next couple of sections.
Okay.
So feel free to hold those.
Oh yeah, okay. So I've got a bunch of those, so I can hold off.
Okay, Jason, any big picture comments?
Sorry for going away there. The thunderstorms here, I think that interrupted my internet connection. I don't know if I'm going to be repeating people since I missed a few minutes. But I do agree that I think staff are very much understudied. If you think about the ratio of members actual members to staff members, clearly a lot of the work is getting done by staff members. So I think, as Jen pointed out, it's underexplored, which does give me one question. I don't know if this is the right time to bring this in, but a lot of the literature that you build on to provide the theoretical intuition for the paper. Some of this stuff was written before I was born. Others is from the 80s. Congress is a very different place now than then, and so I think one concern I have with the lead into the paper is how relevant is the stuff written in the 70s and 80s to today's Congress, especially given the partisan environment and the extent to which decision making and everything is much more centralized than when a lot of the stuff that you're citing and sort of building off of were written.
But can I say something about?
Go ahead, David. Yeah.
Well, yeah, but I mean, so you can. I think a way to do that is to say, well, there are some good studies of congressional staff, and you cite the people because I mean, David Price is not going to be a reviewer. Obviously, he's busy, but you could cite those people briefly and say, and that's what Jason said. That it is a different Congress, and some of the good studies of staff are from a period when we're not sure. So, as I say, there's two different ways to motivate it, because if it's really about party, then you don't need the legislative effectiveness stuff. If it's really about does staff matter, and maybe does it matter in this modern, polarized partisan Congress, then, you cite those people briefly and say, some of the things may hold up now, some of them may not.
And, well, I'll just jump in that I think that we agree with, as far as these last two comments, quite a bit that we wanted to make sure we were engaging the existing staff literature, but
which is old literature.
We really do try and argue that the conditions in Capitol Hill have changed significantly. I mean, it was actually kind of amusing to read some of this older literature when it talks about staff being extremely well paid.
Yeah.
Right?
And K Street wasn't such a lure. I mean,
Right.
it's the opportunity cost now.
Yes, and the problem is, of course, the data back then aren't available, so we can't really compare about legislative career, how long were they in staff and how often did they transition between offices back then. But
the Congressional Staff Directory doesn't go that far back?
Oh, it does.
Not in the digitized form that we purchased.
Well,
I know.
If we had an army of typists.
I'm working on it.
So but I do think it's an interesting tension you've identified. I think we tried to address it a little bit by sort of covering the old literature and then saying, but now how should we rethink that? But I think we could do a better job. But I don't know if Brendan would agree. I think the question is, does staff matter? And we just try and say, yes, it matters, but maybe not in exactly the same way as we used to think about it.
I guess that's the main question I have for you guys. In your early conversations when you were brainstorming this paper, what was the primary puzzles that you felt like you wanted to tackle here?
I think it is, do staff matter, but the thing that's funny about it is the ways in which staff matter. We think the networks of relationships where they might be influencing, one legislator's staff ties to another might have an effect is now via partisan ties, right? Whereas in the past that was less true. And so it's do staff matter in the context of a partisan Congress, so it's exactly what you foreground and background. Because I think we had the same thought about effectiveness and party that David mentioned as well.
I think
that effectiveness is so central to thinking about staff's importance that we felt like we couldn't set it aside. And when in the past when we wrote about party networks of consultants and we foregrounded big party theory, reviewers said you can't show those big party theories are true in this particular case, narrow your scope, and so we've tried to narrow our scope down to staff.
Yeah. I think that means you should dial back the party stuff in this paper.
Even more.
Yeah. Maybe David will disagree, but I don't think it's your central question. I think it's tertiary. And it's a little bit distracting. It confuses the central point of the paper, and maybe it's because right now there's so much attention on party decide stuff that it sort of sucks up some of the limelight. But I just don't think you need it to motivate your paper.
Well, I mean, I think that you could do. You're in the middle now, where it's in there, but it's not really the focus of it. You know, and the two dependent variables you have are not really about that, because legislative effectiveness is not per se about partisanship. It may be it may be affected by, and then voting behavior. You know, that's already that they're not all voting along party lines, right? There's variation. There's that you're explaining. That I think it is a certain tension. You could do more with the party thing, or less. I think at this level, it's probably not helping a tremendous amount. And I don't think the title is what you've been saying to us. You know, how do staff? Yeah. You know, and it's you know. I think it's true, you know, that there used to be some staff who went to work for members of both parties. It was never that common, but it was more common, like Catherine Pearson did. But I mean, Connie Morello, the Republican. So, you know, but that's in the paper enough that there should be more payoff for it than I think there is. I would have probably liked that consulting paper. People just in general, reviewers think their job is to be accountants and to kill anything interesting. You know, that's just not a good way to
So
proceed.
Is this paper under review now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, it's we're about to revise it on an R&R, so this is perfect timing.
I see.
So
well, if you
Karol, we have decided.
Then if you have reviewers already who told you what to do, we're not that important in the world.
Right.
Well, but we think of this as part of a larger project too.
Yeah.
So we're interested in doing more with staff and more with party networks. So
yeah.
all your comments inform that broader project too.
I think definitely, and as I saw you cited me on that, and Casey Dominguez and John Bernstein, I think that case is very strong, and but it seemed like this was, you know, the way it was done in this paper could be more or less.
So I think this is maybe the reason the title stuck is that this paper is part of a larger research initiative Brendan and I are very, very slowly moving on this sort of party networks, but again, that's the way we kind of approach the problem to begin with, but that's not necessarily what the paper ended up being mostly about when we actually completed the analysis. So I especially appreciate the point in the title. Very rare that we revisit the title.
Well, it sets people's expectations very quickly.
Yeah.
So one of the things, I don't know if this is an appropriate point to raise this, but since you're talking about sort of broader research agenda on this topic, one of the things that strikes me is that you make this strong point in the paper about relationships and networks and studying this question from this perspective, and I think you do a compelling job of that. But then in the end, what you've got really is a theory and a model that's really on nodal characteristics, nodal attributes of legislative offices, right? And in some ways, and maybe this is just kind of the next thing, but in some ways it seems to me there's a lot that could be done by studying the tie or the dyad or some sort of the creation of the network, sort of the edge explanations that you know, on which you could show things like staff learning and you know, how things travel from one office to another that you can't quite get at with the same level of nuance with the unit of analysis that you have here. And this is probably something you've already thought about, but for my taste, like I'm eager to know more about that other question. And I just wanted, I guess I'll also raise it because I want to make sure that and now that I'm raising it, I'm thinking through my own head if it's a problem for me or not. I just want to make sure that the theory and the model fit well. If the theory is about networks and connectivity, and then the analysis is kind of at this more nodal level, it's important to have that good epistemological link.
So the network of staff ties that we're looking at the variation that's unexplained by nodal characteristics that is associated with staff ties of a particular type, right? So the spatial autoaggressive framework we're using is fun. It's the best framework we've found for trying to think about associations related to ties, and so we use a similar approach in the consultant paper, and so we're conditioned on the type of tie by using the senior and policy staff. That's as far as we've gotten. I
think you do a good job.
You get tired, and I mean, then you get into like the morass of ergoms, and the data are very sparse on the staffers themselves. So thinking about the characteristics of the staff and trying to explain who gets hired and stuff is a bridge we haven't crossed yet, and it might get too narrow, maybe. Because, like you said, we want to think about what we can learn about legislative behavior.
Yeah.
And if we get too deep into the weeds, I wonder if we get into, the kind of micro theories of Congress.
Yeah.
And I think we are interested in turning it around and making the ties be the dependent variable. But when we talked about that, we thought we first have to convince someone that they should care about staff anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Oh, right. They're not just
and in the world of legislatures, right? Legislative behavior is what we're, the outcomes are really what we care about. Staff are only important to study in so much as we've already shown they matter for that. So
no, I think that's right.
And a lot of the other outcomes, one last point, and maybe this transitions us towards data and things, is when other people have mentioned outcome variables. Oh, it's black now. As I think we allude to in the conclusion, there are lots of other outcome variables we're interested in, many of which are ties, and so you have to then have a multiplex network, and it becomes, again, analytically very difficult to know how to proceed. If you're thinking about explaining co-sponsorship, explaining one network with another network,
yep.
The path forward was not as clear there, but that's, again, where a lot of the interesting ways you could think about showing showing staff effects would be. Right?
Yep.
And I think we agree that node characteristics of legislators are probably less interesting as an outcome, and we'd welcome suggestions on how to move towards ties between legislators in various ways.
Jason?
So in listening to this discussion, I'm curious as to why you are modeling this essentially as a constant effect across members. It seems to me what your inherent thing you're getting at is that there's some agency loss between members and their staff. And if I hire a staff member that came from Nate also had agency loss, and now they're going to apply that to me. Wouldn't we expect members to have some heterogeneity in how they manage staff and how they manage agency loss? I don't know why on earth we would expect them to be uniform across 435 people.
Brendan, do you have?
The model allows for heterogeneity, right, in a error sense, right, Jacob? I'm trying to remember, but in a broader sense, right? We don't have like any kind of attempt to explain variation in individual level effects. It's a classic constant effects kind of model as far as the row itself, the row term that reflects the association with the staff type. Statistically,
these models are non-trivial to extend. So allowing for heterogeneity across units could be done. I would have to think a little more carefully. I mean, I was a little surprised and frustrated that we couldn't get like a version of this that worked with panel data, which is still something that needs to be worked on. But we did try and choose a model that allowed for a lot of heterogeneity in how members who are linked together, but we're not modeling it, and the constant effect is definitely an assumption there, more out of a lack of available tools to let that vary. And maybe some of you would have some directions on where we could go that would, on some statistical ways to do that. In this framework, but trying to use edges as an explanatory variable is kind of where we started, and within that framework, it's not immediately clear how we would do that to allow heterogeneous treatment effects.
All right, it seems like a good opportunity to at least take a quick stopover in the theory section. of the paper, and then we'll move on to data. So does anybody have sort of theory-specific comments to discuss?
Let me use some notes here.
I have one thing to say. I don't know if this fits in theory, but a question I had reading through that is, do we have any thoughts on why staffers move? That seems to, that's the mechanism driving everything here. Are people moving for better pay, for better opportunities, for better, a safer member? Like, why are people moving from office to office with the same job, with the same low pay, and the same crappy hours?
I don't think we attempt to explain that. I think in some cases they're moving to get promoted. We discussed anecdotally someone who went from being an LD to a deputy chief of staff, I believe. Right. In other cases, their members are retiring or defeated. But it seems one of those things that it's hard to generalize about because it's so idiosyncratic.
What about the case where somebody's leaving an office because they suck? And they're pushed out or, quietly chewed upon, and so they go to another office. I mean, for the most part, the theory in the paper is that there's this positive value going from office to office, and you're taking talents and skills and knowledge with you. But what if it's not that?
So this is our failure of explanation. Sorry, Jacob, go ahead.
So this is like this is a thing we've struggled to explain. So what we actually isn't necessarily positive, but consistent. So if they suck in one office, our theory is they're going to suck in another office, right? So that
I see that.
A positive correlation coefficient just means that the linkage makes the offices more similar than we would otherwise expect. That could be both in positive or negative terms.
I think I need to re-find the part where you describe the weighting.
Well, it's not the weighting, but how to interpret the row term. But
okay.
But we can't. Yeah, we can't. It's confusing. It's you're certainly not the first person that we failed to explain that to adequately. So that's something we can work on.
Maybe an anecdote.
So
maybe a
hypothetical negative
one.
Anecdote, like the bad staffer.
I would make a hypothetical one rather than go try to call out somebody who sucks. But that would be fun too.
It's the worst staffer in Congress.
You would seriously get written up about on Heard on the Hill if you did that.
I did want to ask Jason about what, just as far as thinking about heterogeneity and how these linkages might, what is sort of the theory that you were thinking about when you asked that question, like about how that would change across members?
Well, I just think members probably are different in how they manage staff and how much they depend on staff to guide them through, the two things you're modeling are how they vote and how successful they are moving bills through the legislative process. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. Are more senior people better able to manage staff, know what they're doing? Are more junior people more open to manipulation by their staff? Are people who came from a management background, better able to manage this principal agent problem? Or are people who've never managed anyone in their life much more likely to get run over by their staff?
Right. Our consultant paper,
coming from the organizational behavioral literature more than anything else, but
the consultant paper we look at, I think, first-time non-incumbents for exactly this kind of reason, that they might be more pliable to consult.
And the way we can do that is to subset the nodes, like where we would have an analysis where we only looked, say, at freshmen or first people in their first couple of years, but
it's a symmetry is the problem. It has to have a symmetric weight matrix. So if the first term congressman, if we subset, we only see them being tied to each other. Right? So the way this model is estimated requires a symmetry that doesn't really correspond to the theory you're describing. Is that right, Jacob?
Yeah.
Which isn't say you're wrong at all. We wanted to do this, and we've been frustrated by the limitations of this approach.
How did you settle on this approach? Because I don't recall seeing other papers that use this type of analytical framework. I don't have a problem with it. I'm just curious how you got there.
My memory is this kind of goes back to the consultant's paper is that I asked Mike Ward what to do, and this is what he told me. So that
Fair enough.
sort of the beginning of this approach, but using networks in this way to explain node level behavior. I mean, maybe you have other suggestions, but it is not clear to me that there are other viable approaches as long as the dependent variable is node level behavior.
Right.
Which also, in both these cases, right, we cared about, in the consultant's paper, we cared about the behavior of the campaign. In this case, we care about the member behavior more than staff per se. So
right.
That's sort of like the natural way to approach this, but is an active area of statistics that is mostly, the problem is that most of these models are designed for like geography, where the edges don't change, right? People don't, like, counties don't move as far as who their neighbors to. So when we're using this in the network sense, the models have proved not to be necessarily doing everything we want them to do, because the theoretical motivation behind their development is often based in real geography and actual spatial proximity rather than this network proximity.
Right.
So they're not as flexible as we might want.
Right. Analytically, I see the problem there, but like methodologically, I don't have a problem with it. You know, I've heard other people complain about, like the complaints about co-sponsorship, that you're imposing a network on something that's not actually a relationship kind of stuff. And I think you guys are on much more solid ground when it comes to that type of critique, because it's a physical body, it's a physical person. I mean, I see the analytical problem with the geography, but I don't think you have any trouble justifying that it's a network.
Okay. Any other comments specifically on the theory? David?
Yeah, I lost. I was off and I'm back on, so this might have been covered. I'm sorry if someone has already said this. So I don't know. I guess you would consider this theory, if we're thinking about how this happens, how a staffer goes from one member to another. I don't remember this in the paper or in discussion. It might be that, well, there are a lot of, right, members retire, members are defeated, members run for higher office. But even before that happens, often staffers know that that's going to happen, so whether they want to go to K Street or they want to go to another member's office, they might want to do that. So it does theoretically, you're just saying, you're just interested in, does the shared staffer have some effect? But isn't there a question of how the staffer comes to move? Might that make a difference? Necessarily, you've got a lot going on already in this paper, but I'm just thinking about that.
It doesn't leave a clear paper trail because of precisely the kind of anticipation you described, right? So we don't know if someone left before a member retires, whether they knew they were retiring and left for that reason. And there's a lot of different reasons people move. We tried to account for this. So the way this came up in the context of the paper to this point is people worrying that we're getting selection effects, basically, right? People are moving between offices because of similarities on these dimensions.
Yeah.
Unobserved similarities, and that's what explains the correlations we find. And so we can't fully account for that, like any observational study, but we do these falsification tests. So that's the way I guess we get into this problem, is to say, if that were going on, the specific obstacle it would pose for us is it would induce this spurious correlation, and there's at least the kind of falsification test that might, show some evidence of that going on.
Yeah, I got that part of it. I was just thinking about it. I mean, the members, that some staff, right, the members defeated, but also, like, as I said, they can anticipate that. They can anticipate, now the committee chairs are term limited. They can anticipate that. They can probably anticipate the member retiring in a way they couldn't necessarily in the past as easily, or running for higher office, or any number of things. And that doesn't invalidate anything you're doing. I'm just saying, because if this is a larger project, that's just something something to think about. And there are cases when individual staffers know they're going to have to move on, but that's a very individualized story about their member. And then there are cases, when like a big shift in party control, where they're going to lose a lot of staff, and they're all, so they're going to lose. And I want to talk about this also. We didn't talk about committee staff, and where they enter. You have your legislative staff, your chief of staff, but in terms of legislative effectiveness, I would think the committee staff would be very important for people who are chairs or who are ranking minority members, maybe. And I know those are different. They have more professional expertise. They're a little bit less political hack-ish, but they're still in this Congress. Still, there's the majority staff and the minority staff, and so I think that's also maybe something to think about, how that factors in.
I don't now recall. Do you count for committee staff at all?
We can't link them to individual members well, and so for our purposes of explaining individual member behavior, so sometimes you can say the majority or minority, the chair or the ranking member would control it in some ways, right? But sometimes there's other committee staff who might be affiliated with a given committee member, and it was just very hard to know who was linking whom, and so we felt like we just didn't have a strong enough handle to try to explain individual level member behavior with it.
I'd be really curious to see that, though. I have limited experience, but the year that I spent on the Hill, if you were working on, Senate Budget Committee, you worked for Kent Conrad. Like, there was no ambiguity about who your boss was and who paid your bills.
So every single staffer was his?
Yeah.
So this would be the audience to ask, right? Is there heterogeneity? My understanding is there's heterogeneity across committees as to how this works, where in some committees that's true, the chair, and in some there's some allocations to the subcommittee chairs, and some there's even relationships with specific committee staffers. They kind of allocated to different members on the committee. So my wife was on the Hill for a summer, and like that was how the Senate Judiciary worked, where certain members, even though they were committee staff, worked for specific.
Yeah, I think there is. Jen can speak to, and Jason, Nate, everyone. But I think there is some variation, because I remember reading something about the Appropriations Committee. David Obey was very involved in staff decisions, even at subcommittees. And someone was telling me that, and I was surprised because historically the Appropriations Subcommittee chairs, the cardinals, they're supposed to be so important, and I couldn't believe that John Murtha's staff was Obey approved. There's just no way that was happening. But maybe in some of the other cases, so I think there is. But I think you could certainly the chief of staff or the director of the staff of the committee is going to be accountable to the chair. That much and for the ranking member, the ranking minority member, the same thing. And I think the subcommittee, staff director is going to be accountable to that subcommittee chair, even if the chair is involved. You could look into that and talk to people about it. Again, if it's impossible to do and so on, but I think it is something to think about, because for effectiveness and for legislation, those guys are very important.
Sorry, I missed some of that conversation, but I definitely agree that there is heterogeneity and there's sort of different norms and traditions, both across chambers and across committees. But it seems worth looking into, because if the default case, and this might be my own personal experience bias showing, but it seems to me the default case is the staff of the committee work for the chair of the committee, and the staff of the minority work for the ranking member.
Right.
And including those people as a part of the legislative effectiveness of the chair and ranking member seems like you'd get a little pushback, but it's a totally reasonable assumption.
also curious how well connected the personal staff might be to the committee staff from previous jobs. I feel like that would be,
Yeah.
in which your personal staff could help you be more effective, is if they know the key, they're connected, networked, if you will, to the committee staffers.
No question. No, there's no question that the Senate budget and Senate finance people knew everybody in the personal office staff. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you didn't. Here you're just using this as an independent variable, this shared staff, but it's also, you can conceptualize it as dependent variable. And how is it that members come? Did they serve on the same committees? Are they from the same states? Do they come into Congress around the same time? All those things. Why somebody would go from one to the other.
You guys want to write that paper? I'll write it with you. I'll run the ribbons.
Well, I mean, one of the things we have is we have all their salaries. Although that's a little unclear how clean it is. But
so I don't know if you're aware, but David Lazar's been doing a lot of work on this. He has a deal with, I guess it's GPO, that prints the Green Books quarterly, which is the same source that Legistorm gets their data from. And he's got digitized versions of all of these data starting in, I don't know, 2009, 2011, something like that, something relatively recent. But he still gathers it. And he has some postdocs and some other people that are working on it. I don't think they've published anything out of it yet. But they have they have all of that, everything that's in the Green Book they have, which I think is more than what came from First Street. Although I think First Street might have had access to that. I don't know. I don't recall that now. But
so using that kind of data, we were interested in looking at whether your experience in the Hill leads to bigger salaries on the Hill, to kind of look at the value of members, of staff. So making sure to include committee experience is something we're definitely looking into there. But there's that sort of, is it their expertise or is it their access they have to the members they've worked for kind of story? But
absolutely.
Journal to Capitol Hill.
You could test the hypothesis that Brandon said earlier about do you move to get a promotion? I mean, maybe you could test that. I don't know if that's falsifiable there, but I'm very intrigued about the question of is it just your expertise that you're bringing with you, or is it your contacts? Is it your access? Figuring out how to differentiate those would be awesome.
Well, we've toyed with doing a version of there's a paper like that about lobbying that looks at when ex-bosses leave the Senate and the value of your lobbying into your lobbying billing, the official lobbying billing. So it's not everything, but they find when your boss leaves, there's an immediate and discontinuous decrease in your value as a lobbyist.
Of course.
Right.
Let's move on more squarely. We're already sort of there, but we'll sort of open it up for specific comments on the empirics and design of the paper to sort of close us out. Anybody have comments they've been holding back on empirics?
Yeah. So I have a few very small thing in the models, the later tables about voting behavior. The seniority variable is in there. It's not clear why. I mean, you could talk about. I mean, we know that younger cohorts of Republicans are more conservative, and there's not as much generational change among Democrats. But that's not. In the legislative effectiveness, there's a clear argument for why seniority would matter, but not for voting behavior. And that's just a control variable, I know, but it's just not explained, I think, well. And I think the biggest thing is just, the two things are you have a lot of inconsistency across Congresses, and that's not because you did something wrong. I guess that's just how it is. And it's not clear why, theoretically, why that should bounce around so much. And then just these coefficients, when you have significance, it's not clear to me, first of all, how many cases, because is it clustered or is it 2,000 cases or something because it's all these observations? And then relatedly, what is the substantive interpretation of those? Even if it's significant, what does that mean in relation to these other variables? What is that? How big is the effect in terms of anything we can understand?
You guys want to respond, or
Sure.
Jason has something too?
Yeah, we agree that the interpretation of the Congress by Congress estimates is not clear, and we're hesitant about post hoc storytelling that we're not sure if we're just chasing away. So I don't think we have a clear theoretical answer there, except to hope that we're on the right track when we pull our estimates, so that that's giving us a better answer. As far as the substantive effects, so we try to explain that on 22 and 23.
I might have missed it.
Yeah, well, we distinguish the direct effect of a coefficient and then an indirect effect of folks who are connected to that. And so I think there's a reasonable case that these substantive effects are non-trivial. I think we find, if I'm reading this correctly, that on the indirect, so that there's a direct effect of being a committee chair, and then there's being an indirect effect. The indirect effect via the staff network is a 0.29 standard deviation increase in legislative effectiveness, if I'm reading this right. Jacob, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong. Right, but there is a kind of translation process because that row term is not intuitive and people aren't familiar with these models. So we could probably do a better job of emphasizing that point.
Well, like with the Nominate scores, how big a difference? I'm just saying. Do you? Maybe I missed that again. How big a difference is the staff connection?
That point estimate is smaller. I think that the substantive effect example that we provide is for legislative effectiveness. I don't think we provide one for Nominate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we could definitely do, is provide a substantive example there, because those numbers aren't really that useful by themselves. So,
yeah.
Jason?
Yeah, a couple of things on the empirics. This is building off what David's saying. If I'm understanding your pooled results correctly in Table 1 and others, is that an average across those, or are you summing across? What are we? What is the pool effect telling us? That the average across all the cross sections?
It's weighted by sample size a little bit, but it's essentially, yes, pooling the posteriors across each cross section.
So you have 7 cross sections you're pooling, but looking at the individual estimates, it seems like everything's being driven by the 108th Congress. I mean, that's the only one where I think your credible interval would be not including 0. And so in that way, I wonder if that pool estimate is a little bit misleading, given you get negative effects in the 105th, 106th. The 107th, your standard deviation is bigger than your point estimate.
109th and 111th, but yeah.
Those aren't, I don't know.
Those are on the margins, 95%. I mean 90%, but yeah.
Okay, but it still looks to me, in terms of the size in particular, the 108th is driving a lot of this. Is there something weird about the 108th? I couldn't think of anything. It's not like near where term limits would have been up for committee chairs or anything funny like that. So I do worry.
Was it a big party switch that year?
No.
It's like the second Bush. No, it's
smallest.
Oh yeah, you're right.
Not much change at all. Hastert still speaker. Everything's pretty much the same there. So I'm curious about that. Why you would have that one Congress sort of driving everything, and it made me wonder about the validity of that pooled measure. And then on the DW nominated analysis, that's a strange measure to use if you're thinking about, if you're trying to think about a dependent variable that might change, and it might change in ways that are important. If you read carefully what Keith has done there, treating those things as cardinal is not ideal. The DW nominated is constrained to move linearly on a 3-year moving average, and so you can't backtrack. He has the sag problem. He does a lot of weighting at the ends, so you see movement there based on the error distribution. So I wonder if something like a rank order of the member would get at something you're trying to measure. It's not clear to me that cardinal change in Nominate is really as cardinal as you want to think it is.
I guess following up with that comment, I'm all of a sudden worried about the standard errors associated with Nominate scores and how that gets accounted for and how that might further deflate things.
Certainly, accounting for the standard errors would lower the estimate. Brendan, what was the other measures we did? I mean, Nominate is correlated with all the other approximates of Nominate so highly. We tried a couple other ones, and then we just did this because people like to use it. So I'm not sure that we had. What was the other one we used, Brendan?
I want to say Clinton Jackman Rivers, but I'm not sure.
And then I know we use the legislative, the one that's essentially just regression.
Oh, the conservative vote probability, the Fowler. It's like a simple DW nominal. I mean, they all correlate at 0.97. So basically our thought, like, we're with you on DW Nominate. Our thought was mainly we're trying to speak to congressional scholars. This is the standard measure, and everything correlates so highly that it wasn't clear what the best alternative was, right? So rank ordering, you know, you're trading a cardinality assumption for flattening out what could be very small differences into rank differences that might look a lot bigger than they really are.
I guess that's why I like the legislative effectiveness stuff maybe a little bit better in part, but it's another argument for writing a different paper at the edge level where you could just use voting agreement scores and then you don't have to worry about the problems to nominate.
Right.
You know, we've said all these things, but this is, you know, I'm thinking if they have an R&R, I mean, hopefully what we said isn't so different from what these people said. They're not me. I can say I'm not a reviewer of this paper, but you know,
I can say I reviewed it for APSR. So sorry that one didn't work out. I don't think it was my fault.
It was no reviewer's fault. I think we were initially concerned that the legislative effectiveness by itself was not going to be of a sort of general interest dependent variable. And the voting behavior was the kind of next target up. I would love, you know, even not necessarily for this round, but kind of thinking moving forward, if any of you had any thoughts on other sort of dependent variables that would be of interest here. We did go through a few more, but again, they tended to be other relational variables like co-sponsorship rates and things like that.
yeah, that one.
Well, I'm increasingly interested in something that Brendan mentioned earlier, which is some aggregation of these relational variables that I know some other people have been working on, but nobody's put out anything yet that's particularly useful or transportable. But if one of the goals is for us to get a better handle on how legislators or offices or bodies on the Hill and off the Hill are connected to one another, they're connected to each other in a lot of different ways. And so the only way to get at that is to figure out how to aggregate them in a way that's sensible. And I think we're a long way from that, but I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one way to think about this paper in general is it's us trying to transition from studying networks as networks to studying networks in terms of the substantive topics we care about, right?
And that's the thing that I like the most about it, because what gets the network stuff more in the literature is showing how bringing this perspective to questions that we care about, like why do bills get passed or why do people vote the way they do, adds value in a way that we can't get otherwise. And so that's, to me, that's the banner headline.
So two other things. I was just thinking about you mentioned very briefly in the paper, you know, the committee staff has declined, although still important, I think, for this. But Frances has shown that this leadership-controlled staff has grown enormously, and that's in her forthcoming book and other things she's written. And I wonder if a staffer who at a certain point is in that, and that connects to the party network part of it, you know. If somebody at some point in their career is working for one of those, either for a leader or for some party, you know, committee, does that make them, you know, more useful? And anyway, that's definitely measurable. I mean, it gets a little tricky if they work for somebody. Let's say they worked for Pelosi when she was just on appropriations before she became a leader. That could still, years later, because they have relationships, may be valuable. But that's different if they worked for her when she was minority leader or speaker, or they worked for the caucus, or they worked for the steering committee, or one of those kind of things. I think that's a way to bring it to go back to the party network part that you're interested in and the staff part that I think you could do more with it. Maybe not this, but just in general.
Okay. Other comments?
Well, I just wanted to reiterate what Brendan said, to thank you guys for organizing this, and thank you guys for giving us comments. That this is very interesting and very helpful. So, and even technical problems are easier than all of us climbing onto an airplane. So
it's cheaper anyway.
The food's not as good, but
no.
So we're working on that.
Where's my drink?
Yeah,
seriously, come on.
Well, I promised last year and I failed to deliver, but I'm going to try to. I think Jason and I are going to try to, at one of these conferences, host a dinner or a reception or something for all the Lsvw folks. So
okay.
That'd be great.
Stay tuned when we finally follow up and deliver it. It'll be a good one. So
We look forward to participating in that network.
Yeah, that one you can't do virtually. Okay. Any last thoughts before we sign off? Discussants, Jason, anybody?
Thanks for the opportunity to read the paper again and provide some feedback and just have a great discussion on it. It's good stuff.
Thanks for joining us.
Okay. It was interesting. Good luck with this.
Thank you guys very
Good
much.
luck. Yeah, convert that R&R. Good luck.
I look forward to reading this in the future issue of what I expect as AJPS.
No comment.
All right, guys. We'll
All
see
right.
you later.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye.